Hi and welcome to my channel. In today's video we're going to be talking about repotting your houseplants and specifically 3 mistakes to avoid when doing so. But before we start, hi, my name is Alexis and this is Wild Houseplants. I'm a houseplant enthusiast and I also work as a houseplant technician, which basically means when I'm not looking after my own plants, I'm looking after other people's. If you don't follow me already over on Instagram, you can find me there at Wild Houseplants. And if you enjoyed today's video, I'd love it if you hit the subscribe button below. It doesn't cost you anything, but it would mean a lot to me. Okay, so let's talk about repotting. So it's currently spring here in the UK, which is the perfect time to think about repotting your houseplants should they need it. And that's because basically we're going into the growing season where your plants are going to be putting out their best growth over the coming months. And repotting, although you shouldn't be anxious about doing it, it can sometimes put a little bit of shock onto the plant. And so doing it in the spring means the plant has plenty of time to recover from any transplant shock. And then it also provides them with a good boost of nutrients from that fresh soil as they're going into their growing season. Personally, I actually repot my houseplants all year round should they need it. But if you're new to houseplants or you're a little bit anxious about repotting, then now is the best time to think about doing it. So why do we repot our houseplants? Well, obviously it's worth remembering that our houseplants are actually just plants that would be found outside in the wild in their own climate, in a tropical, nicer, warmer climate than we have here in the UK. And obviously when they would be grown in the ground, their roots would have all the space they need to explore and continue to grow. But obviously when we're growing them inside, we're keeping them in pots, whether that's plastic or terracotta. And after a while, you may notice signs that your plants need to be repotted. Perhaps they've become root bound. And root bound or pot bound is basically when inside the pot there's more roots than soil, which means that your plant is no longer getting the nutrients that it needs and it can't really expand outside of this little plastic pot that it's in. So here are some signs that your plant might need to be repotted. Well, the classic one is roots coming out of the bottom of your pot. Now, just if you saw one single root coming out, I don't think you need to rush out straight away, get some potting soil and get on with it. But after a while, you may notice a number of roots coming out the bottom of the pot. You also might notice there's quite a lot of roots in the top of the pot as well coming out. Other signs might be that you notice a plant that you were watering maybe once a week now needs to be watered every 4 to 5 days. Basically, the plant is getting thirstier quicker because there isn't enough soil to keep those roots moist. So it's basically drying out much quicker. And another thing might be that you start to notice things like the new growth is a lot smaller than it was previously, or you might also start to notice things like yellowing leaves. Okay, so number one is when you're repotting your plant, you want to make sure that you're potting it into the correct size pot. You don't want to be repotting into a huge pot, which is way too big for the root system. The general advice is that you pot up 1 to 2 sizes in pots. But rather than thinking about it like that, which I don't find particularly helpful, I think it's better to remove your plant from the pot, assess the size of the root system, and then find the appropriate pot. Just because you're repotting your plant, it doesn't actually mean that you need to go up in size. You may decide that actually you're going to keep it in the same size pot and just give it some fresh soil. Or you may even decide to pot down because actually your plant may be in a pot which is way too big for the root system. So repotting for me isn't actually always about going up. Sometimes it's about staying with the same size pot and just giving it some fresh soil, or potentially assessing if you need to go in a smaller pot based on the root system. So when we pull our plant out of the pot, we can have a good look at the root system, assess the size of the root system, and then make a good decision about what size pot to go up. I generally like to go up around about 1 inch from the root ball, which will give it plenty of room to expand its roots and explore a little bit more into that fresh substrate. But you don't want it to be surrounded with so much soil that it can't possibly process that amount of water, and then you're increasing your risk of things like root rot and disease. The second thing to avoid is planting your plant in a pot without any drainage. It's always best practice to plant your plant into either a plastic nursery pot or a ceramic or terracotta pot which has drainage holes in the bottom, rather than planting it directly into, say for example, a ceramic planter like this, which has absolutely no drainage holes in it. Now, there's always going to be an exception to the rule. You're going to tell me about your grandma's plant that's been in the same pot with no drainage for 25 years and is thriving. And of course, that can always happen. There is always exceptions to the rule. But in general, if we're talking about root health, when we're watering our plants, we want to make sure that the water has somewhere to go. And if you have an outer plant like that, when the water drains through, you can either let the plant soak it up for as much as it needs and then tip it down the sink, or you can take your plant to the sink or the bath and let the water fully drain out. If you are watering, if your plant is potted directly into here and you're watering into here, obviously you're going to have water that's sat at the bottom here and it's got nowhere to escape. Now, over time, what you're going to end up with is just probably root system that's just sat in water. And if it's sat in water for any length of time, again, you're increasing your risk of getting things like root rot and disease. The other thing is, if you do accidentally overwater your plant, it's much more difficult to rectify it, because now you're trying to sort of pour out water while there's soil in it and it all becomes a bit of a mess. So it's much more forgiving if you overwater your plant. Or give your plant a lot of water in one go, which is normally absolutely fine, because it can, whatever the plant doesn't need can drain out of these holes. But if you've got it planted directly into here, that's much more difficult. It's also much more difficult to assess the root system. Obviously, when it's in a plastic nursery pot like this, you can have a look at the roots to see if they're coming out the bottom. And you can also feel the pot to see if it feels firm. If it feels very firm, then it might be a chance, might be a sign that your plant is ready to be repotted, because there's obviously a lot of roots pressing against the side of the pot. So again, as I always say, there's always going to be an exception to the rule. But in my experience looking after houseplants, the plants that start to go downhill are the ones that are planted directly into a ceramic planter without any drainage. And number 3 is planting your houseplant into a potting medium that isn't appropriate for the plant. So there are lots of rather specialised plant mixes out there, maybe specifically for that type of plant. They do tend to be more expensive, so I'm not saying you absolutely have to break the bank buying one of these specialist house mixes. You can make your own DIY house mix at home quite easily using 3 ingredients. One would be either a houseplant soil or cocoa coir as a base, and then making 2 additions, one being perlite, which is going to add aeration into the soil, and the second one being an orchid bark, which again makes that mix chunkier, more aerated, because essentially your roots need oxygen, and if they're in a very dense, very heavy mix, they're not going to get that access to oxygen that they need, and again you're increasing your risk of things like root rot. So I'm not saying you have to go out and break the bank and buy these very expensive soil mixes, although they are fantastic. You can make one at home very easily. I make up a big batch at the beginning of spring, and then I've just got it there to hand whenever I need to repot a plant. And I do pretty much equal mixes of soil or coir, perlite and orchid bark. Make a nice chunky mix, and then you're also reducing your risk of things like overwatering your plant when your water becomes waterlogged, because it's a really nice free draining mix, and when you water it, the water should just drain straight through the pot, and then you know you've got a really nice well draining soil. And just some additional thoughts: if you do find you're somebody that struggles potentially with overwatering, then 2 things to consider is, one is terracotta. Terracotta is porous, which means that the water will escape through the terracotta, and therefore as the water is being drawn out, the substrate will dry out quicker, and you're obviously reducing your risk of your plant being overwatered. The other option is to put your plant into a clear pot. This is actually a bit frosted, but you can still see the root system quite clearly. And now that you can see the root system, you can see any moisture that's on the side of the pot. So if you can see moisture on the side of the pot, then you know they probably your plant doesn't need to be watered. And you can also really easily assess the root system and assess when your plant needs to be repotted as well. So those are two little things if you find you're sort of struggling with your plants and potentially not sure about the root system or when you should be watering. Let's finish this video by repotting this pothos. Although there aren't many roots coming out the bottom of the planter here, this is a plant that's super thirsty at the moment. I literally watered it yesterday, so the soil's going to be looking quite damp, but it has been putting out a lot of yellow growth, which I cut off yesterday as well. But you can see there's still an odd yellow leaf coming in here, and it's been needing to be watered every sort of 4 or 5 days, which is way too much for me and definitely too much for a pothos. Normally with my epipremnum, my pothos, I water them about once every 10 days, maybe once every 7 days come the height of summer, but I really shouldn't have to be thinking about this plant every 4 or 5 days. That is too much. So let's start by squeezing the pot just to loosen the soil and the root system. And then we'll gently, she says, pull it out of the pot. Okay, so you can still see there's lots of nice soil here, but you can see come the bottom, the root system is starting to coil around the bottom quite a lot, and there's quite a lot of root system around here until about halfway up. So we're just going to go up in this instance 1 pot size up because it's not super root bound, and go from there. So let's repot this plant. Okay, I've been out to my garden where I keep all my additional plastic pots, and I've chosen this pot here, which is, I'm not entirely sure what size it is. I'll put it on the screen. So I'm going up from that size to that size. Now, this is actually a little bit big, but the reason I've chosen this one is because I want to add in this smaller pothos. When you're repotting your plants, it's a fantastic time if you want to add in any extra cuttings or combine plants together. So that's actually what I'm going to do today, because I want this plant to be looking a little bit more full than it is. It's only currently got 4 stems, and I had to cut off a few because I said there was quite a lot of yellowing. So I'm going to combine these 2 plants together into this pot and make a much sort of lusher, fuller display. That's the plan. So I've got my DIY mix here, and I'm just going to start by putting a little bit of the mix into the bottom of the pot. Like so. And then adding in my plants. I'm going to just gently loosen the roots at the bottom a little bit, but I'm not super worried about them. These pothos are ridiculously hardy and they will find their way into the new soil. I'm not too worried about them. So just loosening the root ball like that, putting that in that side, and then getting my other plant here. There's nothing wrong with the soil that I've got in here at the moment, so I don't feel the need to completely remove the soil. The times when I would remove the soil is if I had a brand new plant from the nursery or the garden centre, then and it was in like a very dense peaty mix, then I would probably remove all of that soil and use completely fresh soil. The soil that your plants generally come in when they're coming from the nursery or the garden centre is very poor quality, and it tends to be very dense and moisture retentive. So I like to get rid of that and start with some new fresh substrate. But these plants have both been repotted into my mix already, so I'm happy to keep using them. There's no sign of pests or disease with the plants, so there's absolutely no issue with reusing the soil that they've already got. So I'm just going to place that in there and make sure that I'm happy with positioning. Like that. Just going to trail down the shelf, so I want most of the plants to be sort of sat towards the front of the pot. And then I'm just going to backfill with the existing soil I have and then top it up with some fresh. And then we will be done. Always make sure when you're repotting just to keep tapping the sides of the pot. That just settles the soil around the root system. And as I say, if you're nervous about repotting and you haven't done a lot of repotting of your existing houseplants, then start with something simple, something like a pothos, an epipremnum, or a philodendron, or a monstera, something that's really hardy, that's very unlikely to go into transplant shock and cause you any issues from the repot. So be kind to yourself and start with something nice and easy. And then as you grow in confidence, you can start to repot your more finicky plants. Okay. So there we go. And obviously this side is more trailing than this side because this is just a few cuttings. But as this starts to grow and trail down, the plant will look a little bit more combined. I'm just going to give this a really good drink and now pot it back on its shelf, and it's good to go for the rest of the growing season. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this repotting video helpful. If you have any questions about repotting or anything else, then please drop me a comment down below and I will see you in the next video. See you later.